Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman. In case you're wondering what my FIDE rating is, I think I got it about 30 years ago. 40 years ago? I hate to think about these things. 30 years ago, it was 2285. So that makes me a CM. I need another 15 points to get an FM. It's never going to happen. Okay, we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos on improving at chess. And a lot of times people come to me and they say, how do I get better at practicing openings when I get out of the book? And how do I get better about learning positional principles? And how do I get better at the endgame? And the two main answers to those questions is study, analyze with good players. If you analyze with good players, they're going to talk to you about these things and you're going to be able to ask them questions. There's nothing better than that. It's much, much better than, let's say, picking up a book on principles. It's better to talk about principles with good players. The other way to pick it up is to play over lots and lots of well-annotated games. Master games primarily, but certainly amateur games as well. And I always tell people to start out with what I call instructive anthologies. A lot of people don't know what that means, an instructive anthology. Well, an anthology is a collection of games, usually a collection of games played by different players for a certain purpose. So as opposed to Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games, an anthology would be a book like The Greatest Games of Chess Ever Played, or my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, or Irving Chernev's book, The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played. And as you can tell from the titles, those last two are also instructive anthologies. The idea of an instructive anthology is to take players at a certain level and try to bring them up to the next level by talking to them about things that they learn from the games that will help them become better players. That's not the case with, let's say, that's not the case with The World's Greatest Chess Games. That book is meant to show you which games were the best chess games and why they were the best games. And sure, they're going to try to instruct you a little bit as well, but that's not the main purpose of the book. So an instructive anthology is a game book that gets a bunch of games together for the purpose of trying to teach you something, trying to take people and bring them up to the next level. All right, so I thought I would take one of the games that I learned a lot from in an instructive anthology, and we're going to go to Chernev's book, The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played. And we're going to go over game 38 in the book. And I always like the name of this. He gave every game in the book a name based on what he's trying to teach you. And the name of this game is called That Old Black Magic. And the idea is, how can you take advantage of weak squares? In this case, dark squares. That's why he calls it That Old Black Magic. And he uses the game Bernstein Mises from Coburg in 1904. So let's go through the game, and we'll take a little bit of look at Chernev notes, but we'll also compare it to what Stockfish 10 is trying to tell us as well. All right, so white plays e4, black plays Sicilian. Sicilian was a rare bird in these days. Sicilian really wasn't that popular till around World War II. So it was a mainstream opening, but it wasn't, like the super popular opening it is today. And here, white doesn't play the immediate open Sicilian, but plays knight c3. Today, the most common move against knight c3 is knight c6. Black plays the very reasonable move e6. And white plays knight f3, possibly offering a transposition, maybe intentional or not. Hard to say since it's 1904. Black plays knight c6. White plays d4. Now, I've seen a lot of people make really bad mistakes here for black. They play moves like a6 when they could almost resign after d5. For instance, after d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight e7, d6, knight g6, queen e2 check, wins the piece already. Terrible mistake for black to not trade his side pawn for the center pawn. The principle here is, if you can trade a side pawn for a center pawn, and your opponent cannot take back with a pawn, then it's almost always correct to do so. And this is no exception to that principle. White is threatening d5 as we just saw, and black should take. It's by far his best move, and of course he does. White takes, And now black has lots of moves he can play. He can play a6 with kind of a Taimana situation. He can play d6, maybe transposing later into a Skavanigan. What black decides to do is play knight f6, which is a Sicilian 4 knights. My college roommate Ken Bohm played this line, and because he did, I learned it a lot too, and I played it sometimes in tournaments with a lot of success. Here, the most common line today for white is to transpose into the Sveshnikov Sicilian. Knight on 4 to b5, d6, bishop f4, e5, bishop g5, and we're now in the main line of the Sveshnikov Sicilian, where both sides have taken an extra tempo to get to this position. However, in today's game, white plays the other main line, knight takes c6. B takes c6, e5, knight d5, and white plays knight e4 to try to start putting pressure on those dark squares, just like the name of the game suggests. The correct way to play this now, according to Stockfish, and something I didn't know since we didn't have Stockfish helping me back when I was playing this, is to play queen c7 to force white to guard the pawn. And now that this diagonal has been weakened by the 2 pawns moving up, now play queen to b6. And I think Stockfish says that black has equality in this position. It's unbalanced, it's interesting, but approximate equality here. All right, so back to the game. In the game, Mises didn't play queen c7. He plays the other main line, which I probably played a few times myself, which is f5, trying to get white to take en passant so that the pawn on e5 is traded off. So white does take en passant. Black takes back with the knight. And white has nothing better here than to win the bishop pair and try to get rid of the bishop that's guarding the weak dark squares with knight d6. So knight d6 check, bishop takes d6, pretty much forced. Queen takes d6. And now Ludwig Pachmann in his book suggested queen b6, but Ludwig Pachmann wrote his book before Stockfish got a chance to comment on it. And the move played by Mises in the game is considered by Stockfish to be as good as any. Knight to e4. Computer says white's better by about a little less than a pawn here. White plays queen d4, attacking the g-pawn and the knight. Black says, would you like a draw? White says, show me. Black says, okay, draw please, and white says, of course not. So white plays queen to b4. That's why they call it threefold repetition of position. Twofold repetition is just to see what your opponent wants to do. The third time, either side can claim a draw. And by the way, it's repetition of position, not repetition of moves. You can repeat a position on move 72, 104, and 185, and it's a draw. It doesn't have to be back and forth 3 times in a row. Okay, so queen to b4. And white's ahead by about half a pawn. Here, black should probably just play knight f6 again. Black plays d5. Stockfish doesn't like that, says that loses about half a pawn for black. White plays bishop d3, threatening to win a pawn on e4. Black takes the opportunity to play queen d6. Stockfish thinks maybe better is queen to b6. Okay, queen to d6. And now should white trade queens? And the answer is, well, he's got the bishop pair, he's got the weak dark squares. So sure, queen takes d6, knight takes d6. And now white should play the natural bishop f4. That's Stockfish number 1 move. And it has white ahead by about 1.2 pawns. Instead, white plays the somewhat anti-positional f4, which does make the e-pawn backward. If you missed my last video, we talked about backward pawns. And it does put clamps on the dark squares. The problem is it not only blocks in the bishop, but it wastes time for white to get his pieces out. So Stockfish thinks that white has lost almost all of his advantage with that move, which Chernev gives an exclamation point. It's a good idea when you're playing over these older books. You can learn a lot from what the author's saying, but it's kind of nice to have the engine running in the background like I'm doing here to see whether or not the evaluation of the moves and the analysis of the moves matches with what the author's trying to say. And on this move, it doesn't. So Chernev thinks that's a good move, and to help Chernev here, Chernev passed away right around the time they were inventing computers, much less had a really good engine to help him write his books. So, when you're writing a book back, in the 1920s or 30s or 40s, it's going to be a lot harder because people 70 years later, like now, can look at the game and say, oh, I don't like that annotation. But of course, there was no objective way to measure it when they made the book. And you could say, well, that's a good reason not to read the book. And I would say that's silly. That's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That just means you want to be a little careful when you're reading the book to make sure that what the author's saying is really jives with what we now would have a better way to measure kind of reality. Okay, so black here plays a5, and white plays bishop e3. He likes to give exclamation points. He gives this one an exclamation point too. But Stockfish actually says the game's about even. And black plays bishop a6, trying to get rid of the bishop pair and activate his bishop from behind those white pawns in the center. Stockfish says, yeah, that's about as good a move as any. Bishop a6, slight advantage to white. And now Stockfish gives the very inhuman move, rook to b1, also gives king to e2. Bernstein plays king to d2. And now black has two good moves. He can either play king d7, or he can just play bishop takes d3. And here, if white takes with the king to avoid isolating pawns, that gives the knight some very nice squares to go to. But if he takes with the pawn to keep the knight out, it isolates the pawn, and black should be okay here. So I think bishop takes d3 is the logical move. In the book, black plays knight c4 check, and Chernev says black's plan becomes manifest. He wants to force an exchange of knight for bishop. That would leave bishop's opposite color on the board, a circumstance generally heading toward a draw. Black is also playing for a swindle. If knight c4 check and white plays king e2 question mark, then knight takes b2 is a mistake because of bishop takes a6, rook takes a6, rook a b1, skewering the knight to the skewer square of b8, therefore winning a piece. But black, of course, doesn't have to take on b2. He could simply get rid of the bishop that's attacking the weak dark squares, and after king takes e3, he's got his equality. So that's what Chernev says. The problem is that knight c4 check, if played correctly by white, which white does, gives white a really big advantage with the bishop opposite color endgame. It's because here, black's so weak on the squares. So what black should do, as I said earlier, is just play bishop takes d3. So in a sense, knight c4 going for the bishop opposite color endgame, that's rarely going to be a losing move, but here it's really quite a negative move. According to Stockfish, black loses almost a pawn and a half by making this move if white plays the right move, which he does. Bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4. You think, well, maybe black has a chance to hold this game with the bishop opposite color endgame. But he's really, really, really weak on those dark squares, and he doesn't have a knight to fight against the dark squared bishop now. His bishop on c4 is going to be pretty helpless. So this is going to be a really hard endgame for black to hold, even with the bishop opposite colors. Okay, so after bishop takes, white plays a4. Chernev gives that another exclamation point. It's funny, up to the point where black played knight c4 check, I think he had given white maybe 5 exclamation points and black none. No question marks, no exclamation points. Yet the game was, Stockfish says this game is like 0-0-0. So it shows there's a bias toward the winner when you don't have an objective way of evaluating the position. However, after knight c4, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, white does have a big advantage. a4 exclamation point, probably not justified, but not a bad move. Let me read what Chernev says. So this is typical for an instructive anthology. He's trying to teach you something. He says, blockade. The rook pawn is stopped dead in its tracks. He's talking about the black A pawn. It is now a fixed target, always in danger of being attacked by bishop to b6. Black must watch over the pawn constantly with his queen's rook, as loss of the pawn allows white to pass pawn on the A file. Black is therefore deprived of the active services of his queen rook. So what he's saying is, by blockading that pawn on the same color as the bishop in the endgame, the bishop can attack that pawn, and the only piece that can easily guard it is the rook on a8. And of course, that ties up the rook greatly, making white's advantage more manifest. On the other hand, Stockfish says it was probably better for white to play b3 first. Let's show that move. And after bishop a6, simply play bishop to c5. And even if black wants to play a4, white can simply play rook a e1 with a somewhat bigger advantage than he did in the game, but not a lot bigger. We're talking about the same kind of level. So a4 was played. Black plays king d7, keeping his king in the center to guard the dark squares. White now plays b3, bishop a6, and white plays bishop to b6, hitting the pawn. Here, Stockfish is pretty emphatic that black should not keep the rook there guarding the pawn. It suggests first counterattack the f pawn, and when the f pawn goes to g3, maybe play something like rook f5, with the idea that if he plays bishop a5, you can play c5 and get rid of the blockade, and at the cost of a pawn, you now have an endgame where you're not so weak on the dark squares anymore, and you're down a pawn, but you have the bishop opposite colors to help you. That's not an easy thing for a human to do. All right, so in the game, black reluctantly plays bishop c8 to let the rook guard the pawn, but that makes his position that much more passive. And Chernev's comment is, dominates every important... I'm reading you the next move. First, white plays king e3. Black plays rook a6, and now white plays bishop c5. And here's the comment I was about to read you. Dominates every important square on the board. Black's king cannot reach d6. His rooks cannot seize any open files. His bishop has little scope, and his pawn center is paralyzed. White has a one game strategically. What remains is the matter of winning it. A technique, that's the word they use for winning a one game. A technique is the matter of winning it that the masters take for granted, but one that is not always easily demonstrated. It is done here in magnificent style. And that's true. I think Stockfish will agree that Bernstein played the rest of the game pretty well. All right, so let's keep going. Black plays king c7. He really doesn't have a lot to do here. White plays king d4, ready to bring his king into the dark squares where it's perfectly safe. Bishop d7. And I'm not reading all the instructive comments that Chernev's making. You can buy the book for that, but we only have half an hour or so for our video, so we want to make sure we get done the game, and, I'm not trying to steal the copyright of the book. I'd rather have you hear my comments. I'm just sprinkling in a little bit of what Chernev says so you get an idea of what you're going to get if you buy the book. Okay, so bishop d7. White doesn't need the rook on a1 anymore, so he puts it on the e file, hitting the backward e pawn. Notice he can't win that pawn. It's guarded by a bishop, but he can tie up black's army in pieces and slowly penetrate on the dark squares, which is something he's going to do. h5, rook e5, blockading again, blockade, blockade, blockade. Black's completely passive. g6, rook g5, he's ready to bring the other rook over, get every single piece in there. Rook to g8 to guard the pawn. King to e5, ready to bring his king in and attack this pawn multiple times, but his king will also be attacking e6. Notice black can't easily get his pieces over to try to stop that. Black plays bishop to e8. And now white could take the pawn on e6, but it gives black some hope. After king takes e6, he could check him and again go for bishop opposite colors. White decides that pawn is a goner anyway. and he plays king f6. Stockfish says king e6, king f6, basically going to lead to about the same thing. All right, so king to f6. That's move 31. Oh, sorry, skipped a move there. Rook e1 first. Black tries to get the other rook back into the defensive area, and now king f6. Okay, black has nothing to do. Bishop back to d7. Now, black is hoping white will blunder with rook takes g6, rook takes g6, king takes g6. That would be a quiescence error, stopping your analysis too soon. Then you'd have to look one move further, which is rook g8 check, skewering the king and the g2 pawn, and the win is basically in jeopardy. Right now, white's ahead by about 3.5 pawns. If he plays rook takes g6 question mark, rook takes g6, king takes g6, rook g8 check, and now it says the best move is king f6. Let's say he doesn't do that and he goes after another pawn, and black plays rook takes g2, hitting the h2 pawn and the c2 pawn. White's advantage now is down to 0.7 or 0.8 with bishop opposite colors. That's how much of a giant blunder it would be to take the pawn. You always want to look a little further after you do things to make sure it's still safe. A lot of my students don't do that. They say, well, I saw I could win the pawn and I took it. And I go, well, did you look at the next move to see what would happen? They say no. That's called a quiescence error. We had a video earlier on, I think, the Immortal Quiescence Error game. Was, I think, maybe my first amateur game, which I put in here. Quiescence errors are an important thing to avoid. So white, of course, is a grandmaster. He doesn't fall for that. And instead of taking the pawn, he plays g3. So there's not going to be any skewer. And now that pawn can't run away. Notice the rook on a8 can't go to f8 to check the king because that's a dark square guarded by that wonderful bishop on c5. This is a wonderful example of good bishop versus bad bishop. And even though there's bishop opposite colors, black just doesn't have enough counterplay to hold, and white's just slowly building up the pressure so that when he does break through, there's going to be no counterplay. Okay, so on the 33rd move here, black plays rook a e8. White's in no hurry. He could play rook takes g6 now. He just plays rook on 1. Looks like he's trying to checkmate himself. But notice again, there's no way to safely check him. So the king on f6, which basically has no moves and could be mated if that bishop wasn't on c5, is instead super safe. Doesn't take much to make the difference between getting checkmated and being super safe. Okay, black realizes he's losing this pawn, so he just guards the h pawn. White says one pawn down, more pawns to go. Rook takes g6. Black tries to guard the 7th rank with rook h7. White says, I know trading into bishop opposite colors usually is not good, but here my pieces are so good and your pawns are so weak, and my kingside pawns are going to be monsters when I trade off. I'll just go to the 7th rank. Rook to g7. Rook takes. King takes. Oh, sorry. I got ahead of myself there. Black played rook on e1. First he played here. Now white took the rook. Rook takes. King takes. The game is, by the way, this book originally was written in descriptive notation, and I'm converting to algebraic. So when I see rook takes rook, I'm not realizing it's on the wrong square like I would if it was an algebraic. So king to g6. Rook to h8. King to g7. Removal of the guard. The rook has no squares to keep guarding the h5 pawn. Notice white didn't want to play rook takes h5 right away. He could have, but king g7 is more accurate. Rook d8, nothing better to do. Rook takes h5. He's up 2 pawns with connected passed pawns. Even with bishop opposite colors, easy win. Bishop e8 hitting the rook. Rook h7, now willing to trade rooks, even with bishop opposite colors. Too much of an advantage now. Black plays rook d7 check. White plays king h6. Rook takes h7 check. King takes h7. Black plays bishop here. He wants to skewer the pawns on this diagonal. The problem is, by the time he starts picking up some of these pawns, White will just be able to run a pawn down and get a queen. White says, all right, I'll start with the h-pawn. Black says, I realize it's hopeless. If I just leave my bishop there, you're going to destroy the blockade and start pushing the pawns. So he tries to counterattack, but everything's hopeless here. So bishop to d8, White plays c3 and says, if you want to take my pawn, you're going to have to take your bishop off of my g-pawn. Choose your poison here. Black says, all right, I'll take the pawn. White says, all right, that lets me push the g-pawn down. Black says, well, maybe I can bring my king back. King d7. Of course, let's just play it out. If he takes the pawn, White pushes. If he moves the bishop out of the way with check, White just plays here. Notice the bishop is guarding the a3 square, so the black pawn's not going anywhere. And White will simply move out of the pin and push the pawn in. So it really doesn't matter. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let's catch up to where we were. But by the way, I was making the moves from the book, but I actually have the game in my library here, so I didn't have to remember the moves. I could have just hit next move, next move, next move, which is what I'm doing here to catch up real quick to where we were. Okay, so he removes the guard, takes the pawn, trades off the rooks. Bishop goes for the skewer. White says, be my guest. Takes the pawn. White plays g4. Black tries to bring the king over. g5. e5, desperately trying to create some counterplay. White says, yeah, I could take the pawn, but I'll just as soon get 3 connected passed pawns. Black says, just for fun, I'll take a pawn while you're getting a queen. White plays f6, and now if Black plays a move like, let's say, king to e8 or king to e6, White will just play king g7 and push the pawn. The bishop can't get involved with stopping it. It's blocked off. So I think after f6, Black called it a day. I think Mises resigned. Okay, so what's our story of the day? The story of the day is instructive anthologies are a great way to learn how to play openings, middle games, end games, plans, tactics, positional ideas. If you have a good author who's trying to teach you things, here Chernev's talking about how to play against weak squares. I always remember this game. I just like the name of the game, that old Black Magic. And, you play over enough of these kind of games and you start to get a feel of, oh, here's how I should do it. And that's what you want. You want the good authors and the good annotators to tell you how to do that. So instructive anthologies are the way to go. It's really nice stuff. I tell people, when you first start studying chess, maybe spend about 30% of your time reading these instructive anthologies. In my first 3 years of play, I went from being a fairly weak unrated up to a 2,000 player. And in that time, I read about 2,000 games. They weren't all instructive anthologies because we didn't have as many instructive anthology books as we do today. I've got a list of them on my website, www.danheisman.com. Just go to the right under More and go under Recommended Book Lists. And I have my instructive anthology list. But I didn't have that many, but I read about 2,000 games in 3 years. That sounds like an awful lot, but I was taking about 20 to 30 minutes per game. And I was reading on the average about 2 a day. I was still in high school, so, I would do my homework during the week, and then on the weekend I would catch up. I'd sit down at a sitting with a pocket chess set and go through, half a dozen games at a time. Usually didn't take me that long. All right, hopefully enjoyed our video today. We're trying to get up to 1,000 subscribers so I can give out that free lesson. So if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.